Today I'm excited because I have another one of my law school colleagues with me. I have Dean Boyd from Brooklyn Law School with me. He is the Assistant Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid, and today we're going to talk all things student financials. Just in case you're not sure who I am, let me introduce myself again. I am Dr. Nadia Castriota. I am the Director of Law Student Success and one of the admissions advisors here with Barrier Breakers. So let's get right into things. Welcome, Dean Boyd, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
I love to talk to my law school peeps, right? Bringing you guys on our podcast and our episodes. And so let's just get right to it. The financial aid process. Do you want to give us a general overview and then kind of talk about some things specific to Brooklyn Law School?
Yeah, absolutely. So, financial aid in law school, um, I like to tell students you want to approach financing your law school education with a very complete idea of, all the different types of resources available, the incentives for the law schools in terms of how they um, use those resources, and how to best position yourself to get through the law school process with the minimum amount of debt, right? So, broadly speaking, there are two types of institutional financial aid: merit based aid and need based aid. And there's a lot of nuances in terms of forms of scholarships that are under those two umbrella terms. But in general, you're talking about scholarships that are awarded to students on the basis of what we think of as merit, but the real way to think about it is essentially the extent to which the school is prepared to discount their tuition to that student based on the essentially the reputational value that student brings to the school, right? So make that a little bit more obvious what we're talking about. Schools that award merit aid largely award that aid on the basis of LSAT scores, GPA scores, and other indications in your application package of the attractiveness of that candidate to that law school. And then need based aid, obviously, is the extent to which the student presents a picture of financial need. And there are lots of different ways that schools may go about determining that. And so you'll have some schools that only award need based aid. You have lots of schools that award primarily merit based aid with a much smaller percentage of their scholarship budget dedicated to need based aid. And then you have other forms of scholarship that that don't fall into these buckets, but they tend to be much more limited. So donor funded scholarships, specialty scholarships that are sponsored by maybe outside organizations or alumni groups, that kind of thing. But that tends to be a much smaller component of any law school's financing package. The bulk of the way that you'll finance your law school education in most cases will be a combination of merit based aid, need based aid if you're eligible, and then loans. So for most students, you're going to be able to borrow up to the cost of attendance at any particular law school, to finance the gap, whatever gap is left over. And that's how most students will do it.
Right. So I'm glad that you mentioned that there's the merit scholarships. So scholarships that during the application process that students don't really have to apply for. They're automatically considered based on what the school is able to give out or disperse, right? They have their own scholarships based on a combination of LSAT and GPA and other things that the readers, or I should say admissions committee, is looking for in that applicant's file. The second thing that you mentioned is the need base, and I just also want to point out that that is specific to some schools, because some schools do not offer need base, so it is specific to the school. And then the third thing that you mentioned right at the very end, which is just as important, is loans, because I think that sometimes in undergrad and then coming over to law school, that students get a little confused when we say financial aid. And so they think, oh, free money again, financial aid. I just have to fill out my FAFSA and I'm good. No, you're still doing that part, right? Going and filling out the application. But now we're talking about specifically loans that, like Dean Boyd said, up to the cost of attendance, that's going to help supplement with all these other things that you do have access to. So making sure that you know your resources and making sure that you know what's available to you once you're applying to these schools, especially once you get to the point where if you are offered a seat or offered admission, that you then talk to the schools to find out what is available to you. And that's where Dean Boyd is going to be a really big, important part of the application process or the admissions process once we get to this part,
Yeah.
right?
So I would even say um, earlier. So we do what we call an admission strategies workshop here for students that are interested in applying to law school or thinking about it. This doesn't even have to just be the students that are interested in applying to Brooklyn Law School. We provide these webinars and workshops for anybody that's interested. And one of the components that I always like to talk about is building your list of schools. So the way that you begin to identify law schools that you want to apply to, using that to determine where you're going to be, sort of most competitive, what are going to be sort of reach schools for you, what are schools that seem very likely that you'll be offered for admission. And in part of that building your list process, you should be inquiring of these schools about their financial aid resources, whether they are a merit aid only school. Not only do they have need-based programs, but how do they work? So here's a good example. Most law schools require FAFSA. Up until this year, we also required the FAFSA because of the many people may be aware of all the problems that were experienced this year with the FAFSA. On the federal level, Department of Education made a lot of mistakes and they had to delay the FAFSA process. So we re-engineered our need-based process. It has always had a significant component of that process, the collection of parental tax information and student tax information in determining financial need. And it used to be that connected together with the FAFSA was how we would reach a determination on the eligibility for need-based aid. We decided this year to move forward without the FAFSA because the timing from the Department of Education just didn't work with our admissions process. So this means you have lots of students who present as needy, or they may present as having a lot of family resources because their parental tax information demonstrates some means. But we do an interview, right? So we have a conversation with the student where we're asking the student to be clear with us, as clear as they possibly can be, about the extent to which their families are supporting them, the extent to which they are working or they intend to work, to be honest with us about for instance, their savings and what they're likely to do. So if you have a student that presents significant savings and tax activity because they were working before they applied for need-based aid, there are schools where you may want to know that could affect your award. It may turn out that would depress your need-based award. At Brooklyn, it would not, as long as you represented to us that you did not intend to work while you were in school. We would change our calculation for your need-based grant eligibility based on your representation that you were not working. Obviously, we still have to distribute need-based aid in the fairest way possible. So there are some people that say, hey, my family's not helping me, but if there's a lot of financial means there, you're in a different position than someone whose family is in no position to help them, irrespective of what the family decisions might be. So that's why we do collect all that information. And as you're building your list of schools, you want to think about location of law school. You want to think about the value proposition, all the different values that law school practices. What is their mission? What kinds of careers are they likely to launch you into? But also, how do they administer their financial aid? We talked about merit aid, and you made a good point that I probably should have started with, which is in most schools, you do not have to apply for merit aid. You will automatically be considered for it. If you're admitted to that law school, they will typically either in your admissions letter or not long after that, you'll receive some indication of what merit award they're prepared to offer you. The sort of bad news is that there isn't much you can do to impact that award at that point. But the good news is you're already probably doing what you need to do to maximize that award, because it's basically based on how attractive an applicant you are. So everything that you're doing in terms of making yourself competitive as a law school applicant is also going to make you that much more competitive for merit-based aid, which tends to be for most schools the largest share, if not the entire share, of their financial aid program.
I love that. So you said so many things that I just want to kind of recap for our audience, because you started off with the list of schools from the very beginning when you're thinking about who you want to apply to, and that's speaking the barrier breakers like language, because the students who take the journey with us, that's exactly what we ask them to do. We ask them to create a law school list. And we talk about putting schools in three categories, right? So making sure they have their dream and their reach schools, their target schools, and their safety schools, and then making sure that they do their research. So I love the fact that you brought that to light, because research is so important once you start the journey. And then, students, I would say their top things of concern is always financials, right? They want to know exactly, can I get scholarship, or what does the aid look like, or what does the resources look like? So thank you so much for bringing that to light. And then you went into, making sure that upon the research that they figure out, ask questions, right? They don't know what they don't know. So of course, contacting the school and starting to engage with them and ask the questions about, the merit scholarships. And, maybe, this also ties into what my file needs to look like. So if merit scholarships, there's nothing wrong with you asking questions, but you can always ask, okay, look at the median of the school and saying, okay, well, if I meet the median or better, are my chances higher of getting a merit scholarship? Would you say that that's something that schools are, open to talk with applicants about?
Yeah. So one thing that, and this is also a part of the building your list conversation, is students should be aware that schools are themselves in very different financial positions, right? So Brooklyn Law School is an unusual institution in that we're just a law school. Most of the law schools that your audience is probably considering applying to are parts of colleges or universities. Where the law school is situated within the financial picture of that institution, it's not something that any individual student is probably going to think that much about. But the approach to awarding scholarships by each law school is very different because the financial realities for each law school are different, right? So I attended one law school. I worked in admissions at a different law school. I taught legal writing at a third law school, and now I've been at Brooklyn for 10 years, and I can tell you, almost 10 years. And I can tell you that every single one of those schools had very different median scholarship awards, merit scholarship awards, 75th percentile scholarship awards. That's the awards that are likely to go to students that they anticipate will be in the top quartile of their class, and then different criteria for students to whom they probably will not offer scholarships or merit scholarships anyway. And when you're building your list, trying to get a sense of whether a school is in a position to offer you a more generous scholarship because it's financially able to, or it's unable to offer you a greater scholarship because in fact that school, like say our school, actually needs to collect some tuition revenue, right? So we are an extremely generous law school. Something like 90% of our students are receiving some kind of financial aid. But you'll see that many fewer students, because we're trying to distribute, our philosophy is that we try to distribute as much aid as we can to as many students as we can. And what that means is that fewer students will get really large awards. Some of them will, but fewer than you'll see at some other schools. We have a peer school I won't identify, but we kind of understand each other's financial aid strategies. And we have another school that, their strategy is really, they go after, like the top third of their class are getting really high scholarship awards. The bottom quartile of their class, not so much. Whereas we're more likely to be distributing, some amounts all across. And you can see that in publicly available data about how law schools have distributed their financial aid in the past. So not to get too in the weeds, but for your students that are comfortable doing the research and they want to go to, the ABA is our regulator. They require every school to produce what they call the 509 report. That report is detailed information about admission statistics, financial aid information, enrollment, other kinds of resources. And you can see in the 509, right on the ABA's website, they have basically a widget there where you can put in a school, you can put in the year, and you can make it produce a PDF of a report. And that report will tell you, for instance, Brooklyn Law School last year, the median award, our median scholarship award was like $35,000. That meant half the class got scholarships larger than that, half the class got scholarships below that. It doesn't tell you what you're going to be offered, but that's useful information as you're building your list. If you say, I really don't think I can afford to go to a school that can't offer me a competitive scholarship, and you check the 509 report for all of the schools that are on your list, and none of them are providing particularly significant scholarships to the median students in their class, then maybe you need to re-engineer your list, because you're probably talking about going through the hard and difficult process of admissions for those schools, perhaps earning a seat in those schools, but being uncomfortable with the amount of debt you're going to have to undertake to actually accept one of those seats. You may want to add some schools to your list that are able to be more generous with scholarship, but you won't know that information if you haven't looked to see publicly available information on the sizes of scholarships those schools typically award. And the same kind of information is available, although it tends to be less accurate. Another metric that I think students should look at is average student debt for the graduates. So, I think ours is, it's high. I'll tell you, I'll be honest. Law school is very expensive. I personally don't think students should be that put off by taking on educational debt for law school because it's a tremendous investment. I've certainly enjoyed my career. I've had 3 different careers, all using my law school degree. I was very, lucky to be able to pay off my loans relatively quickly, but I borrowed, in excess of $100,000. It's paid itself off many, many, many times. And that's not necessarily going to be true for every student. You have to make these judgments for yourself. But, there's a big difference between undergraduate admissions and financial aid and graduate school admissions and financial aid. Graduate school admissions and financial aid, typically you are going to get less generous merit-based scholarships and institutional grants. That's true. But at the same time, you are generally earning a degree that will permit you to service the kind of debt that you're likely to take on. That being said, you should still be very aggressive about managing the additional debt that you take on, and make sure that the schools that you're considering attending are able to offer you a value proposition that makes that make sense, right? It does not make sense to take on $300,000 of additional debt for a school that does not offer you a path forward for servicing that debt, whether it's low. And we should talk about other kinds of programmatic resources while we're at it. So we talked about merit aid, we talked about need-based aid. We should also talk about, here's at least 2 other categories that we should talk about. One are GI Bill and other military related benefits. We have the Yellow Ribbon Program. The Yellow Ribbon Program is a very limited program for students who present with veteran backgrounds. It is the only students that are eligible are students that are at the 100% eligibility level for GI Bill coverage. For those of you that are veterans, you may know that means you probably would have had to have 36 months of service or 30 consecutive days, I think, of active combat. I think, it's a very narrow categories. You should look that up. I don't want to make a specific representation about that. But for those students, lots of schools, including ours, have very generous programs in terms of matching the federal grant money, GI Bill grant money, towards your tuition. So if you're a veteran, you should definitely investigate the extent to which your GI Bill benefits might be amplified by the school's resources to get you at least up to, or up as far as, I should say, the full tuition and fees. Most schools will not cover anything beyond that. So you're not going to get a stipend in addition or living expenses, but there are other government programs for veterans that cover those things. So if you're a veteran, you should definitely look into that. And then the other type of program are low income repayment programs. So these programs on the school level. So we have such a program for once you graduate from law school, if you undertake public service work that requires the use of your JD degree, and it is eligible up to a certain income level, and because of the type of work, you're eligible for a program called LRAP, the Low Income Repayment Assistance Program, where essentially we are paying your loan payments while you're eligible up until the point at which you've worked for 10 years and we would have essentially paid off your loans. There are federal versions of this program. There are different versions at each school. You want to investigate these programs if you have an interest in public service practice. That being said, they tend to have reasonably strict income levels. So if your intention is to, potentially, even if you're going to be a public service lawyer, you can certainly do that and make more money than is typically anticipated by some of these programs. But when you're thinking through the strategy of how you're going to finance law school, how you're going to deal with the debt afterwards, those are additional questions to be asking each school. If there are veterans programs you should be aware of, are there low-income repayment programs that you should be aware of? And then our school, and then lots of other schools do this too, we provide a list of outside scholarship resources that you might want to apply to. Maybe the City Bar Association has one, or the Women's Bar Association. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it. A lot of those scholarships that have been based on race, ethnicity, or other kinds of sort of identity-based criteria may be more limited in light of what we all know was a very challenging environment for education for those of us that care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there's still some of those programs available. Many of the people who in good faith designed those programs to create diversity in law school and in the profession always intended it to be about more than race and ethnicity. It had always been about increasing the richness of the lived experiences of the people that we want to bring into the profession. And so it's not really that challenging to change the way that we talk about these scholarships. It's going to take us some time to get the language right, make sure that we're complying with the law. But I think most of the schools that I know of that cared about these things in the past still care about them. Most of the people that are involved in the profession that cared about these things in the profession still care about them. So we're going to comply with the law, but that doesn't mean that we have to agree with the Supreme Court.
Absolutely. I think that's evident this year, right? We've seen law schools, even though the ruling came down right before the application process started for the students that are coming in this fall, we've seen from this end that so many schools have voiced that they still care about it and still want to move forward and make sure that they can work with students to have the opportunity to express themselves, and that it is still very important. So thank you for saying that. I do appreciate that. I think sometimes the students need to hear it because they completely shied away from it as soon as the ruling came down. And sometimes they're afraid to ask those questions. So thank you for putting that out there. I do appreciate that. And like I said before, they don't know what they don't know. So they turn to us and to you, right, to ask these questions, and for them to feel comfortable is for them to only have the information. So I love that. Thank you so much. And you've said so much, Dean Boyd, right? We've only been on for a few minutes, but you mentioned all types of resources and financial resources for our students. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the timing of it all and where, right? Where do they go to apply for these things, and what do the deadlines look like? We talked about that this is a process that starts from the very beginning, and it will kind of follow them throughout the process when choosing a school. But where do they go, right? Sometimes they go to the website and they look for, like you said, these external scholarship opportunities. But in terms of applying for these, the application process, I know it looks different from school to school, but can you talk a little bit about that at Brooklyn Law?
Yeah, absolutely. So our application goes live September 1st each year. That is around the time most law school applications go live. Some schools maybe go a little earlier, some schools a little later. We are essentially rolling admissions until we're full. What that looks like is in most years, about April 15, April 15, we have our big first seat deposit deadline. So everybody that we've admitted up to that point, we say, if you want to come to Brooklyn Law School, you should place a seat deposit by April 15. After April 15, I have a sense of how full I am, how many students are indicating that they're likely to come to Brooklyn Law School. But usually at that point, I still have seats. And so I'm still taking applications. Then on June 1st, we ask for a second deposit. We call it the down payment deadline. After that June deadline, I have a much more of a sense of whether I'm full. To back up to September, though, when I start admitting people as early as November, I usually don't start actually admitting people until late November, I will begin to award merit scholarship money. And what that means is, from a timing perspective, earlier is almost always better. So you don't want to submit your law school application until it's as strong as you can possibly make it. You want to make sure that you've done all of the work on the personal statement that you can do. You want to make sure that your letters of recommendation are the strongest ones you can find. You want to make sure that someone else has had eyes on your resume. All of that advice remains. But still, the earlier you are able to get your application in after September 1st, in most cases, the better positioned you're going to be for merit scholarship aid. Put yourself in the position of someone like myself or any other dean of admissions and financial aid in the country, building my class for the following fall. Psychologically, at time equals zero, I have all of these empty seats. I'm going to have between 380 and 400 students in my entering class in most years. I have zero at that point. I have a scholarship budget. I'm not going to tell you how much money it is, but it's finite. At that point, I'm nowhere near that budget. I can offer as much money as I think makes sense to each one of those students. After I've admitted 1,000 students, I get nervous. What if they all come? I can't afford all of these scholarships that I've extended. So once we get into January, February, March, April, you're going to start to see merit scholarships at most schools reduce. So, what often happens is there are some schools that they say nothing about scholarship until that period. I know one school, they admit everybody in all the way up until say January, and then I think like February 1st ish or so, they give everybody their scholarship offer because they're that worried about overspending their scholarship budget, right? If you're not in that batch, let's say that school doesn't get your application file until March, your chances of getting a significant scholarship there is probably lower than it otherwise would have been. So, from a timing perspective, merit scholarships always better to be earlier in the cycle. That being said, the best advice is still that the merit scholarships, the leverage you have for your merit scholarships is the quality of your application file. So don't send it in early just to be early, because the strongest file is still going to get you the highest merit award, but be aware of the timing. If you can affect the timing, try to affect the timing by when you plan to take your LSAT or GRE, when you ask people for the other kinds of components that you might need for your file. Just be thinking about those things, because this is not a situation in which lateness is rewarded. Need-based aid, again, this is another stuff that's highly specific to the school. Typically, the schools that require the FAFSA, obviously you have to wait for the FAFSA. And then if there's like ours, a school-based application, you should just try to get it in as soon as practicable after you've been admitted. So I always say, try to get it to us within a week or two after you've been admitted. If you need more time, certainly ask for more time. But one of the things we didn't talk that much about was negotiating merit aid scholarships, which is a thing. Students will often say, hey, you gave me this merit scholarship. I need more because either this other schools are offering me more, but I'd really rather come to you, but I can't make it make financial sense. Or, hey, I just think I'm really strong and can you give me more? And again, depending on the financial situation at the school, depending on where the school is in its mission cycle and class building process, they may be in a position to entertain that. If they're considering that, they will often want to know whether you're already being awarded a need-based grant, right? So in my case, let's say I give you a $10,000, I give some student a $10,000 merit scholarship award. The student says, hey, school B is giving me 25,000. Would you consider matching it? In all fairness, the likely I'll say no, but maybe I'll give you a little bit more. But I'm not going to say yes until I know from my financial aid team whether or not you've applied for a need-based aid and whether or not we're planning to give you one. Because then we might end up extending more institutional aid to you than we intended, or less. We may end up providing you less support than we can afford to, and we wouldn't want to do that either. So trying to get the application, the need-based application in as soon as you can after you're offered admission. For us, that's what makes sense. At other schools, they may have hard deadlines. There are some schools that will say whether or not you've been offered a seat, you need to apply for need-based aid by, say, February 1st. So you need to be in touch with every school on your list. And the other thing I'll say about need-based aid, by the way, is even if you think you are not eligible for need-based aid, for most of the schools, you should still apply, or at least talk to your admissions counselor about whether you should apply. One of the things that has happened, lots of financial aid offices are all over the country. We used to have a portion of our budget that we earmarked for diversity scholarships. We are no longer comfortable awarding those scholarships the way we did before in light of the Supreme Court decision that we've alluded to. A lot of that money, not just at our school, but at lots of other schools, has ended up in the need-based award budget. We're extending almost 300% as much in need-based aid awards this year than we did relative to last year, because that money that we used to distribute to build diversity to students who we sort of presumed had more financial need, we're not able to do that anymore. So we're doing it through our actual need program, and that may be a better way to do it. Maybe that's the way we always should have done it, but that's where a lot of schools are. So apply for need even if you don't think you need it. Make sure you're clear about the deadlines for that school, or make sure you apply almost as soon as you're offered a seat. And it's always appropriate to ask for more merit aid. Don't be frustrated or upset if the answer is no, because for some schools, the answer needs to be no so that they can either help other students or keep the lights on.
Yeah. I think you said so many different things there, but all so very important. One is definitely make sure that you know, like, just follow the instructions,
Yeah.
right? Make sure that you know your deadlines. Talk to the schools. I mean, we tell students that when they start this process, they're going to be talking to people. So reach out to the schools, start, interacting with them, engage with the school, ask your questions, find out who's over, right? The admissions dean, is there a director of financial aid? Who am I going to be talking to throughout this process to answer these types of important questions for me? So thank you for sharing all of that. And bringing to light the different applications that you do have, whether it be for scholarship or for loans or for something specific to your school, like the need based um, grants. So to switch gears a little bit, I know we didn't really tap on into the loans
Yeah.
yet, and also you mentioned that you have some specific scholarships to your school. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, the
Yeah.
specific
So,
scholarships that you have to Brooklyn Law?
well, there's really nothing for entering students to worry about apart from, what we've talked about. There is a public service program that is a fellowship that entering students can apply for, but the lion's share of our funding is really in the merit and need-based program. I will say this about loans. The first is, in order to be eligible for federal loans, federally subsidized loans, I should say, you do have to complete the FAFSA. So you may not want, if you have reasons why you don't want to do it, just understand that you're going to have to come up with significant, usually there's a significant gap between cost of attendance and whatever the financial aid award is. If your family and yourself, you have the means to undertake that, that's fine. Generally speaking, because they're federally subsidized, you're going to be able to borrow up to the rest of that money, in terms of cost of attendance for each year. A couple of things to think about though with that. One is credit worthiness does matter. So you you want to be thinking right now. I mean, it's rare, but it does happen that students that have defaulted on other federally subsidized loans are not able to secure those loans for law school, and that's very difficult. Especially in this interest rate environment, you do not want to have to take out private loans to go to law school. It'd be like mortgaging a house that you can't see. I mean, it's so be thinking about how you keep your financial house in order while you're in college, or if you're in that period after college before law school, which is much more common now. When I went to law school, about 2/3 of the students went directly from college to law school. I was among that group. Now, 60% of students are between 1 and 5 years out, 63% or something like that for our class. So if you're in that period where you're working and contemplating law school, make sure you're being financially responsible and you're taking care of your credit, because that will assist you in not only securing the kinds of federal subsidized loans you might need to pay for cost of attendance during law school, but to keep your cost of credit low for just managing your living expenses during that period. So that's something that our financial aid office talks about with our students all the time, and that is counseling them consistently about being financially responsible before and during law school. Because of the second thing I want to talk to you about, which is really how constraining from a careers perspective it can be to mismanage your law school debt. You really want to be in a position. I was, like I said, I was very lucky. When I came out of law school in 1996, I worked at a big law firm in New York. In that period, law firms started trying to compete with investment banks for talent, and they started paying us even more. And I paid off my loans as soon as I possibly could, because I wasn't sure that I wanted to be in a big law firm for the rest of my life. If you are certain that you want to be in a really highly paid aspect of the law for the foreseeable future, for the next 20, 30 years of your career, then perhaps it makes little difference how much you borrow, because you're so sure of how much you're going to be earning. I will tell you that a lot of people found themselves in very lucrative positions after law school, but didn't want to stay in them because the lifestyle is very challenging. The environment they felt wasn't consistent with their values. If you don't make the right financial decisions before and during law school, it can really constrain your choices after. And you want to, I've always thought the whole point of, being successful, whatever that means, is degrees of freedom. If you want to be a teacher, you can be a teacher. If you want to be an investment banker, you can be an investment banker. But if you have to be a partner at a law firm because you owe $300,000 of debt, and so does your partner, I don't think you're very successful. If you don't want to be there, and that's another thing, our financial aid counselors are really aggressive about saying to students, hey, are you sure you want to borrow all of this? Do you need a $2,000 a month apartment? Can you find one that's cheaper? Can you borrow less money this year than you did last year? So that when you get you out of law school and you have that diploma and you have that job, whether it's at big firm, small firm, DA's office, whatever it is, that loan payment that you're looking at isn't quite as menacing as it otherwise could. It isn't sitting at the dinner table with you making decisions. So, I encourage you all to be very careful about how you value, this value proposition question with these schools and how much money they're going to offer you versus how much you're going to have to borrow and how comfortable you're going to be with that because it's going to be with you.
Oh my goodness, you've shared so many, really important tips for our students today. If you can give them some advice, right, before we're moving into a new admission cycle. I know you're closing out one right now. You have a class coming in, and we're moving into a new one, meaning that we have clients signing on with us now so we can start prepping them for fall 25, the entering class of fall 25. What advice would you give to our students or our listeners right now, to kind of help them along the way as they start to think about applying to law school and what the financial situation or burden might be for them? What advice would you have for them, or what things do you think they would ask more during the
Yeah.
process to the schools?
Yeah. I mean, I think hate is probably a reasonable term for how I feel about U.S. News rankings, right? Because what they promised to do for consumers and students versus what they actually did, the extent to which they distort the kinds of choices that students make, but also how law school administrators have had to sort of manage their institutions in the rankings environment. So, just as an example, one of the things that I despise that's a part of my job is that once upon a time we were so focused on the median LSAT that we report, and we are still quite focused on it, that it would make much more sense for me to offer a student who I think is a weaker student but happens to have one more point on the LSAT score, a larger scholarship to entice that student to come to my school than a student with with two or three fewer points that I think is going to be fantastic, a better fit for our school. The result of that thinking, I don't want to say misrepresent, but schools using the rankings to communicate to students that the value proposition that they present based on the kinds of doors they're going to kick open for that student is so vastly different from the other schools that student is considering. That I think is a mistake. So I I went to Harvard. I worked at Columbia. I taught at Cardozo briefly. I'm at Brooklyn. All great schools, unbelievable faculties, unbelievable students. I can tell you that none of those schools is 100 times better than the other. None of those schools are 50 places or 70% or 60% better. I can tell you that some of those schools will make, the first couple of jobs you get, the institution's name will do a little bit more heavy lifting for you than other schools. That's true. You really need to try to hold in your mind and assign a value to that because for many of your students, that's going to be the decision they're making, right? Do I want to borrow another couple of $100,000 and have this institution do more heavy lifting for me? Am I more comfortable that my own performance, my own networking, my own ability to land the right first or second job, together with the support from the institution? Like every institution is going to have a great career services office. They're going to have great faculty, people to help you along the way. But really try to hold in your mind, okay, what is the school offering me from a career perspective? Look at the career outcomes of its students. Look at the data that the 509 report, it has data on it about, the sizes of the firms that these graduates get, how much money they earn when they come out. Go to their career pages and look at the institutions, the organizations and companies that hire out of that school and really try to get a sense of the value, the career value that this school is going to pass on to you and at what price. And from that perspective, build your own list of ranking, right? Try to understand the schools, not just in some absolute sense of best school to worst school, but in a sense of best school, to slightly less good school for me based on the value proposition that the school is offering me, its ability to get me into the career I want, and at a price I'm comfortable paying. There's a lot more things that we could be talking about in terms of the values the school practices, the kinds of courses it teaches, its clinical programs, and all that stuff. You asked me to talk about financial aid, and for that purposes, I'll say, in this context, I'm talking about the financial value proposition that that school is offering you. Try to create some understanding of that based on the schools that offer you admission. And I think you'll be much more successful in landing a seat not only that you're excited about, but that you feel financially comfortable about, because you want to have those 3 years of law school. They're going to be stressful, they're going to be hard, but you also want to have the sense at the end of this, I'm getting my money's worth, and I'm excited about my ability to manage my financial life after this.
No, I love that. And it's such a good way to end today's episode, right? We tell our students that they need to make sure they do their research. But at the end of the day, we want them to be confident and comfortable in their decision. And whatever that means for them, if it's meaning that the community is the right fit, if the culture is the right fit, if the financial is the right fit. So I'm glad that you talked about that making sure they do their research, ask the questions, find out more about the school, talk to the people at the school, find out what resources are available to you. It's all a part of the process. And yes, we understand that it can be overwhelming and sometimes frustrating and stressful, but the return on investment is so big. So we tell them some sacrifices in the beginning, but bigger blessings at the end. So thank you, Dean Boyd, so much for joining me today and to talk about this really important topic. I think you offered so much information and more. So I am grateful for you to share this with our listeners. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we close out today?
It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm happy to help any of your listeners if they want to address specific questions to us at Brooklyn Law School. We have a admit Q at brooklaw.edu is our regular admissions line. If they need me in particular, they can ask the person in that box and just send it on to me, or you can just write me at eulas.boyd at brooklaw.edu. I'm not just, I think of myself as not just an evangelist for Brooklyn Law School, but for the profession, right? So we're here to help. And I think a lot of my colleagues in law school admissions feel that way. We're not just here to sort of push our institutions. That's important. But we're also here because we really do believe that the profession needs you. There's nobody hires a lawyer at an unimportant moment in their life. And it seems like, 1.3 million lawyers in the country, it seems like a lot, but all of you probably know someone who can't afford a lawyer. And that's because there aren't enough of you. So thank you for, the decision you're making to come to the profession, and literally anything we can do to help, we're happy to.
I love that. Thank you so much. And for our listeners out there, we hope that we provided you with some great information today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, or even post follow-up questions on our social media. We'd be happy to send them over to Dean Boyd or to answer them on our monthly podcast. So thank you so much for joining us today. Take care, friends, and best of luck in your application journey.